My name is Alfredo Bonet. Good afternoon, everyone. I am the Secretary General of Círculo de Empresarios, and I will be the moderator of this first session of this forum for the next 50 to 60 minutes that will be dedicated to the world economy. We are, as you know, navigating uncharted waters in these months. We have never been faced with such a deep economic decline caused by an external shock like this sanitary crisis, and by the measures applied by the governments to combat it with different degrees of success. We need to come out of this situation soon and take the opportunity to reconsider and reinforce our growth models, as our chairman was saying right now. This crisis has accelerated many of the trends that were already happening. Low productivity, trade frictions, the questioning of the capitalist model, weakening of liberal democracies, lack of trust of citizens in their leaders and institutions, populism, protectionism, crisis of multilateral institutions, geopolitical rivalries and shift to a bipolar world, etc. The already very high level of uncertainty for business leaders and for citizens in general has increased today after knowing the preliminary results of the US elections. We plan to touch upon many of these issues and others today in the coming minutes, and also tomorrow that we will concentrate more in Europe. Today's session is more dedicated to the world economy and tomorrow more to Europe. But it will be held, as you know, tomorrow here at the same time. For these discussions, we have invited a selected group of prestigious experts that I will introduce now very briefly. We have Bart van Ark, a Dutch national that has a PhD in economics by the University of Groningen. He started his career at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research in London, and later at the University of Groningen, where he has been teaching economic development, technological change, and growth for the past 20 years. He has been chief economist and head of economy, strategy, and finance center at the Conference Board in New York for the past 12 years, until last summer, when he moved to the UK as managing director of the Productivity Institute and professor of productivity at the Alliance Manchester Business School in the University of Manchester. We also have with us Natalie Tocci. Natalie has held research positions at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies in Florence. She is now the director of Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and honorary professor at the University of Tübingen. She's a special advisor to the EU High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, and before to her predecessor, Federica Mogherini. Her research interests include European foreign policy, conflict resolution, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. We also have Jesus Fernández Villaverde, who has degrees in economics and law by ICADE in Madrid and a PhD in economics by the University of Minnesota. He is, since 2007, professor of economics. He's also director and graduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania, fellow of the Econometric Society, member of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and advisor to several relevant publications. He's also regularly invited speaker at Fundación Rafael del Pino, where I think he feels at home. Martina Larkin has degrees in finance by St. Gallen and Fordham University and MBA by ESCP Europe, and is a Yale World Fellow too. She worked in marketing and sales for Nestlé Switzerland, was later associate vice president at Lazard and Company, a New York-based investment bank. And she has worked for the past 11 years for the World Economic Forum in different responsibilities, being now head of the regional agenda, Europe and Eurasia, and a member of the executive committee. And we have Ignacio de la Torre. He has a degree in economics by ICADE in Madrid and in law by UNED, an MBA by INSEAD, and a PhD in history by UNED. He has worked for 20 years in investment banking and capital markets analysis and stock exchange in UBS, Deutsche Bank, and Arcano. He is now partner and chief economist at Arcano Partners and also associate professor of economics and academic director of the finance master's programs at IE Business School in Madrid. And let me start right away. I will ask 2 rounds of questions to each of the panel members that will be responded in 2-3 minutes each, if possible. And after that, I will ask some more questions coming from the participants or among yourselves. I will start with Natalie, because unfortunately Natalie has to leave us in about 15 minutes at 6:30. So I will ask Natalie a couple of questions, and then we will let her go, and we'll stay with the rest of the panelists. Natalie, geopolitics are changing a lot the world scenario. There is a growing rivalry between the US and China in several fields, especially in technology these days. And trade, investments, and value chains between these two countries have been one of the most important engines for growth in the world economy in the past decades, or especially in the past recent years. This decoupling between the US and China shows that we are moving towards a less cooperative and more nationalistic world. And as I said, China is growing, it is recovering faster and gaining ground after having defeated sooner the pandemic than we have done. And we would be interested in knowing, how do you see this, the impact of this process of less cooperation and more rivalry for the future of the economy, of the world economy?
Well, thank you, Alfredo. And I mean, for me, the place to start really is in observing the fact that over the course of this pandemic, we have seen crystallizing something that had obviously been brewing for some time. So as you said, we already knew pre-COVID that there was a sort of confrontation brewing between the United States and China, but we understood this confrontation up until COVID, and I would say exclusively in sectoral terms. So there was a trade war, then there was a sort of tech war, and there could have been other sort of disputes and confrontations. And I think what we've started seeing over the course of this pandemic is that this is a broader confrontation. I mean, it's acquiring, and it's acquired, I think, already, political and ideological overtones, a sort of political and ideological embedding, which I think is going to, in some respects, remain regardless of what happens in the coming hours and days in the United States. And I'll come back to this in a moment. But I think the fact that there is this political and ideological overlay does point to the direction of a crystallization of an international system that goes back, in a sense, towards a bipolar structure. Now, it doesn't have the same connotations as we had during the Cold War, for the simple reason that even if we have a push, as you were hinting at, towards deglobalization, towards a decoupling in particular of the US and Chinese economies, there will still be interdependencies, and there will still be far greater interdependencies than there were between the Soviet Union and the United States back in Cold War days. So I think, we shouldn't exaggerate in the parallelism, but I think it's clear that as this confrontation acquires this political and ideological overtone, this is something that will inevitably impact the world economy. Now, I say this, and I come back to the point of what happens in the United States. I think this will remain true regardless of who wins at the end of the coming, hours or days. And in fact, in some respects, one could imagine that whereas in a Trump scenario, a sort of Trump 2 scenario, there would still be, in a sense, the same animosity that we've seen over the last 4 years, but there would also be an instinct that Trump has had to try and strike deals with authoritarian leaders. I mean, he kind of tends to sort of, see eye to eye with them. Normally, it kind of doesn't quite work out, but at least at times there is the intention. And I say this to say that if we end up with a Biden scenario, which of course as Europeans is I think there's no secret in, I'm reading no secret in saying that this is the way in which we would like things to go. That confrontation in some respects may actually become even more acute. And it would become even more acute precisely because it's also a political and ideological confrontation. And for a Biden administration, things like human rights and the status of Hong Kong or Taiwan have real meaning, far more so than they would do under a Trump administration. So I think this is, regardless of what happens, a confrontation which is here to stay, which of course then fits with other trends that we've seen happening regardless of the US-China confrontation, which is, of course, the push for deglobalization, the debate about perhaps a more regionalized globalization as a consequence of the pandemic. But of course, here I step into the terrain of economists that are far more qualified than me to address some of these points.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I would like to, before you leave, even if tomorrow we have a session dedicated to the European Union and to Europe, I think I need to ask you something, because I know you are an expert in European external action and among other things. And I believe that in this scenario that you have been describing now between this rivalry between the US and China, we are here in the middle in Europe, and we are trying to do and to find our way into this new geopolitical scenario, searching this strategic autonomy and also willing to maintain and spread our values and principles to the rest of the world through our external action. But some of these principles and values that we're trying to export, and sometimes even questioned by some of our member states in this kind of some divide that we have internally. Do you think that the European Union will be able to succeed in exporting or expanding these values to the world, or it is too naive to try to do that?
Well, I mean, I would say, in a sense, I think this is a story of a glass half full and a glass half empty. And let me begin with the glass half full bit. I think, if we look at the way in which, as Europeans, we have reacted over the course of the last, 6 months or so, in particular, if we take the period beginning in, I would say, third week of April onwards, I would say, well, finally, we're beginning to get it. We're beginning to get that we are a community of fate. We're beginning to get that we simply couldn't afford to repeat the same mistakes that we made during the Eurozone crisis, during the migration crisis. We simply couldn't have afforded to fail, or at least not to succeed one other time. And I think, there has been this recognition of Europe really stepping up to the plate. Now, perhaps we didn't quite factor in that the second wave would hit us the way we did. Perhaps we didn't quite factor in that we're not really in a post-pandemic recovery mode, but we're rather in maybe we have to deal with what a pandemic economy actually means. So perhaps even the decisions that we took back in July in terms of the Next Generation EU fund, etc., will be insufficient. But I think it would be unfair not to recognize the fact that a pretty momentous step forward has been made. And not only it has been made in terms of putting real money there, 750 billion is a significant amount of money, but also that this is and will be channeled to ultimately what I sort of would define as 2 of the 3 priorities that this political and institutional mandate came to office with. This commission came in saying green, saying digital, and saying geopolitical. And I would say that in fairness, now behind the green and the digital, there is real money, there is real substance. This is not just slogans. So this is the glass half full. And I come to the glass half empty. And the glass half empty is precisely on the geopolitical, where I think that for various reasons, partly to do with the pandemic, meaning the fact that we are very inward looking at the moment because of the pandemic, and that the focus of attention has shifted from, I would say, foreign policy, security and defense over the last 5 years, very much, and rightly so, I would say, in many respects, but more to a socio-economic focus. We seem to be now missing that, that ambition, that momentum, in terms of becoming a global actor. Now, I come back to the US election because, of course, today it's very difficult to talk about anything else. And simply to say as follows. Now, obviously, in the event of a Trump scenario, disaster, but it would reawaken the debates on European autonomy and strategic autonomy, because it would be another slap in the face. But I would say that even in the event of a Biden victory, in the way in which it is being configured, if things move in this direction, meaning we're not talking about a landslide victory, I think even that should be sufficient for Europeans to recognize that we cannot simply stick our heads in the sand again, that the agenda for strategic autonomy is there because the United States is a country which is deeply divided, because even if Biden wins, Trumpism is alive and kicking. So, I very much hope that what is happening in these hours is going to be, in a sense, the wake-up call that we need, regardless of how things go in the end, to begin to bring back the substance behind that geopolitical ambition that has to live alongside the green and the digital, because in many respects, it is the external side of an internal coin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie. Very interesting. I think that I thank you for your participation. I think you can leave us now if you need to do it. And thank you again for coming here. I will move now to a change subject. I'm going to ask Bart about his present job. I think my question is. Can you hear me? Yes, I think my question is related to productivity. Productivity is stagnant in many parts of the world, and has been like this for quite a few years or decades sometimes. And it looks like the digital revolution has not translated into this productivity growth that we expected. There is a shared view that productivity growth will have to come at the cost of jobs and machines replacing jobs in many sectors for the future. On the other hand, believe that the digital revolution will create more jobs than it will destroy. What is your view on the economic side of this issue? I will try to ask you later about more the social side, but I mean the economic side of what is going on with productivity and what we can do about it.
Right. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Alfredo, and the Círculo de Empresarios for having me on, and also the Fundación Rafael del Pino. It's a great event, and putting the advisory board together here and hear the various perspectives. Your question is quite a step down from what we were talking about with Natalie, but not unrelated, because I do believe that if we can grow productivity, particularly if we can grow jobs that are productive, is a major driver of a stable economic development. So in that sense, it's certainly not unrelated to the issues about stable political developments and geopolitics that we've been discussing a couple of minutes ago. It's a great question. The traditional way that economists think about new technologies, like digital technology, is that it will lead to what we call structural change. And structural change will then ultimately cause productivity growth. And once productivity growth is there, we will gradually begin to have room for new economic activity, and that will create jobs. So it's a very kind of comforting view. And that is that technology and innovation is the greatest thing on earth. And yes, it may make us a little bit uneasy, and we can talk about the social concepts in a minute, the social consequences. But that ultimately it will be good for the labor market. I think the question at this moment in the digital economy, and certainly in sort of the latest developments with artificial intelligence and robotics, whether that is still true, whether this time perhaps is different, and whether we're really seeing that promise of new jobs down the road. Now, I think we should step back a little bit and think a little bit about some of the characteristics of this recent technology wave. So, first of all, I think it's really important to make a distinction between what I call the old digital economy and the new digital economy. The old digital economy is what we were thinking about 20 years ago, when we had the rise of the personal computer. The beginnings of the internet was a little more than 20 years ago. And although that was disruptive, we all remember the ramp up to the year 2000 and the impacts that that had on the economy. But ultimately, it brought us more productivity growth. It even brought us more jobs. The new digital economy is quite a different thing. It's the shift to mobile, the shift to cloud, the shift to ubiquitous access to the internet, and then the rise, as I mentioned earlier, of artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning. It's a very disruptive kind of technology, it seems to be, and quite different from what we've been seeing in the old digital economy. And maybe we could argue that sort of in the early stages of this new technology, we have used this very much for automation. And you could argue that's a little bit of the low-hanging fruit. We just automate and it will save us jobs. And that's a good thing to have, perhaps, but do we indeed get the new jobs and the promise of new jobs down the road? The second important background that we need to have for this new technology is to make a real distinction between digitization and digital transformation. So digitization is really the adoption of all these new technologies that I just mentioned, and it will lead to new products and new services and new business processes. But digital transformation is something that is much bigger, that really is a strategy that enterprises apply in order to really leverage these new technologies and the data that these new technologies produce to really develop completely new products, but also to connect organizations, to connect people, and to connect physical assets and processes in the organization. So it's a much more deeper kind of change that companies are experiencing with these new digital technologies. And maybe we're just at the beginning of that process of digital transformation. We're always thinking that every new technology is diffusing much more rapidly than the previous one, and to some extent that is true, but the absorption of the technology that is driving digital transformation is really something that takes time. Digital technology really is a general purpose technology. So it's a generic technology, it has lots of applications, it has wide uses across the economy, and time will tell what ultimately the impact of this is going to be. So I think that's an important background. We are probably at the early days of really understanding the new digital technology. Now, will we now get to the next stage of the digital technology where indeed we will get the jobs created that we've been hoping for in the traditional way of thinking? First, we get structural change, we get more productivity growth, and now we're going to get more jobs. Azimoglu and Restrepo last year have been arguing a really interesting paper, which I published last year, where they said, well, so far we really had the wrong kind of artificial intelligence. All this artificial intelligence was indeed focused on automation. And we're not yet at the point that we're seeing much artificial intelligence that is really creating new productive jobs. That technologies are becoming complementary to human capital and to the creation of jobs. So, for example, now you can think of applications, for example, in education, where artificial intelligence can really not let teachers leave their job, but empower teachers in order to provide much more individualized learning, to be able to much better understand the needs of individual pupils, and target and tailor the programs towards their needs. Another example is healthcare, where you could now begin to see that artificial intelligence can help doctors and nurses to get information about their patients much faster, therefore be able to give them better treatment and to free up their time to spend on other things, including, for example, social care. So, and especially in these times of COVID, of course, those are really important new applications of artificial intelligence. So I think at this point in time, we would basically say that time has to tell. But so far, we have to be honest that artificial intelligence and new digital technology hasn't created an enormous amount of new jobs in net terms. We lost more jobs than new jobs that were being created. But certainly down the road, we have to develop policies and technologies and innovation systems that can help us to really get to that next stage, that we will see the creation of jobs and not let this technology ultimately fail in terms of bringing more wealth and and improve our living standards.
Thank you, Bart. Very interesting and encouraging response to my question. I will keep changing subjects completely when talking to you to all these different aspects that are now under debate. The next one is for Martina. Martina, we have heard a lot during these past months about the concept of stakeholder capitalism. In the Davos Forum meeting in last January, it was one of the main issues, this need for business to focus not only on shareholder interest, but on all the stakeholders' interests. And also the preoccupation of climate change is part of this more let's say, stakeholderish capitalism we are moving towards. But when we were in the middle of this discussion, then the pandemic arrived, and it may have shifted the priorities of businesses. Sometimes it has shifted them to even survival. So my question is related to this. Do you think that this movement or process towards a more social capitalism and way of managing business will be affected by the pandemic and the crisis it has created as the result of the measures taken by governments, or not?
Thank you, Alfredo, and thank you for having me here amongst all of you for this conversation, which is really important, even if it can only be digital. I'm glad we could proceed with it. Let me maybe first explain why we think stakeholder capitalism is so important. As we've seen, the current systems really failed us when it comes to addressing this global pandemic, the global climate crisis, inequality, and many other challenges. And there's been a lot of criticism of capitalism that creates big divides and divisions, but also, has a single sort of drive and purpose of creating financial returns. And what we have seen really is that this current crisis highlights the need to think differently about the way we live and do business. And this stakeholder approach takes into account the broader impact of business on society. And executives and investors have really started to recognize that their long-term success is closely linked to that of their customers, employees, and suppliers. And we have seen the term stakeholder capitalism, or this concept, actually gaining momentum, particularly in a crisis like this, because it will be about survival. But to prepare for a future, companies can really not operate as they have in the past, and it really offers the best opportunity to tackle both the environmental but also social challenges and health challenges and other challenges that we're seeing. And important bodies like the U.S. Business Roundtable, which is America's most influential business lobby group, has announced this year that it would also formally embrace this concept of stakeholder capitalism. And we, of course, all know about impact investing, which is about linking financial returns also with environmental and societal outcomes. So there's clearly a momentum in that direction, and companies and boards have had to recognize that important determinants of a firm's capacity to create and sustain value, economic value, is very much dependent on them also addressing major issues, which usually has been, or in the past perhaps has been, dealt with more technical specialists, whether it's around climate change, technology regulation, all of these points. Talent has been mentioned before. These are now boardroom conversations, and used to be much more specialized conversations in the past. So what this really means is that a company's approach to people, to the planet, and to innovation must be given much bigger consideration when thinking about their own survival, and also their resource allocations and strategic goals. And when we think about opportunities, this is now a really incredible opportunity for business leaders by giving stakeholder capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, but a more holistic meaning to progress and growth, a concrete meaning and a concrete sort of outcome that can move beyond their initial legal or financial obligations to investors, but really to also share a duty to show progress in society and serve society at a larger end. And this can spread across different, very concrete measures. As we have seen, there's a increased interest in the business community to address issues that are linked to climate change through the Paris Climate Agreement, but also the Green Deal that Natalie mentioned earlier from the European Commission. Of course, the SDGs, there's a huge interest from the business communities to contribute to those and to be part of those. So we can see now that there's clear measures and metrics also in place where business can contribute and measure their progress, which I think is very important from just having an ideological or conceptual idea about how to improve things.
Thank you very much. You have, we agree. We always say that probably business has shown its most social phase during the worst moments of the pandemic here in Spain and everywhere, because they have come after the population and citizens to try to reduce the impact, helping in many different ways. So thank you very much. I have another question for Jesus. This one is related to international trade. The problem we have now is that international trade has always played this role of engine for economic growth. Even if after the financial crisis, it reduced its contribution to growth. But now we see an even more difficult situation. All the world and in a depression, an economic depression, globalization in crisis. We see the rise of protectionist measures, and this synchronized impact of growth around the world. And we are missing this engine role of international trade in these coming years. That would be very good for taking us out of this situation. How do you see the prospects for international trade as a driver of growth in the coming months or years?
I guess I'm not particularly optimistic. I think that the move towards protectionism and partial deglobalization is not an accident. It's the product of a changed political economy, mainly in the US, but to some extent also in other countries. The move towards a much more protectionist United States, for instance, really started with the Obama administration. Then we had 4 years of Trump. And what I think we are going to see when Biden becomes president in January is that a lot of people in Europe is going to be really shocked at how little the US foreign policy and trade policy is going to change. We need to remember that historically, the Democratic Party has not been particularly favorable to trade. Things have changed a little bit over the last 4 years because of a series of issues within the United States. And in that sense, I don't see in any way the United States pushing towards a more free trade agenda. China probably thinks about this issue from a slightly different perspective. They always have tried to link themselves into the international economy as a way to further their own national interest. And in that sense, I think that the leadership in Beijing is quite pragmatic. And at this moment, they have an economy that is doing relatively well within their borders, and especially given the current situation, I don't think they are going to be particularly looking forward to making many changes. In that sense, I think that a lot of people made a comparison now to perhaps we are going back to a second Cold War and compared with the Soviet Union. I actually think that comparison is deeply flawed. And that is much better to think about the situation that the world was perhaps after 1880, 1890, with a relation of cooperation/conflict between the United Kingdom and Germany for supremacy in Europe. And that's going to be a much better analog. Germany, of course, in this case is going to be China. The United Kingdom is the United States. Europe is going to be the third man out. Think about France in that situation in the world. And it's going to be really an issue to which extent these two large countries are going to be able to handle that situation. And just to wrap up, I think that at the end of the day, every time I come back to Europe, I see a deep misunderstanding of how deeply the United States has changed. It has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. It has changed, for instance, in terms of ethnic composition. It used to be the case that the elites in the United States were Eastern people born in the East Coast, white, descendants from Europeans. That's not the case anymore to a large extent. And if you ask someone like Harris or many other leaders of the new generation, they don't really have much of an emotional or cultural link to Europe. And they are going to think about the world in logically very, very different frameworks that even just one generation ago. And that's why I don't see a scenario where international trade comes back to be a main dynamic force within the world economy.
Thank you very much, Jesus. I'm going to follow on this with Ignacio. Ignacio, well, we all know what are the prospects for world economic growth this year, with this generalized but unequal reduction in activity and GDP all over the world, with the sole exception of China, who's the only country is going to grow, I think, this year. I know that the research institution that you lead, Arcano, is following very closely all this, and I would like to hear your opinion on how the world economy will recover. How do you see the prospects?
Well, thank you for the invitation. GDP should come down this year between 3 to 4 points and should go up 5 points next year. So we could say that it's going to take the world 1 year to recover the lost production. This is a much better situation than 2008-2009 crisis. To give you some numbers, China, as you said, has recovered GDP in 2 quarters. It's going to take the Americans 5 quarters to recover GDP, and the Europeans 2 years. It took Europe 6 years to recover the GDP lost during the 2007 crisis. And I think the reason why this crisis is less malign than the one in 2008 is threefold. On one hand, the monetary response by central banks is being much more intense. They have injected around $7 trillion in markets. This has been a much more decisive action than those you could see in 2008, 2009. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP, is more than twice as relevant. Second, the fiscal response has been historic. Around $12 trillion have been spent by governments since March, which you could claim is almost 3 times as relevant as a percentage of GDP than the fiscal response implemented in the previous crisis. And third, and very relevant, money is flowing. The money which is being injected at central banks is reaching to the final economy. Monetary growth in the US is close to 25%, it's 10% in the case of Europe. Those are the best money growth you could see in the last 40 years, whereas money was in the negative territory in 2008, 2009. That's why I think that the situation is completely different from the one we saw a few years ago. Medically speaking, there has been only 6 reinfections published in papers out of 45 million cases. So we could work upon the assumption that once you have gone through COVID, as I have, then you are immune. Then if you divide dead people by the infection fatality rate, which is 0.65%, you can find out how many people have gone through COVID. If you make some numbers, it's around 16% in the States, it's around 17, 18% in Spain. If you look at large cities, New York City is 43%, Madrid is around 40%. You're getting closer to herd immunity. And once you begin to have the first vaccines by January, February, perhaps another 15, 20% of people can get immunized before summer. So I think on H1, large cities will be out of COVID and will leave COVID behind, and the rest of the regions probably during H2. If you put all these ideas together, I think 2021 should be a good year from an economic point of view.
Thank you for the good news. We are very happy to hear you, Ignacio. I would like to go back to Bart. Bart, I would like to ask you 2 questions. The first one is, do you agree with Ignacio, who he just said about how fast we will be able to recover? And then second, following on your previous response, of course that you are now working on a productivity institute, new studying productivity, and we know that private-public cooperation is also one of the main issues. I think that your new institution is a private-public institution, and we are interested in knowing, as I asked you before, we are moving towards a more technological, proactive model in which it will take time, as you said before, to create growth, to create jobs. Sorry. As you said, probably artificial intelligence has been replacing or has been working on automation, but not on helping workers to work better and to do better. So do you think that from the social point of view, we will be able to keep and to control the social impact of this job destruction until this starts creating jobs?
So first of all, I hope Ignacio is right. I'm just coming out of a job of being 12 years chief economist, so I'm not. I'm happy that I don't have to predict the economy in 2021, but I still have the benefit from sitting on the side at the conference board and hearing the conversations. I think the scenario that Ignacio is describing is a positive and optimistic one. Everything needs to get right in the next couple of months. Indeed, we need to create some kind of herd immunity and some combination together with treatments, with a vaccine that at least to a limited extent will be available to a wide range of the population. There could be quite a few hiccups on the way, and a lot of this is going to be determined by the resilience of the economy to actually recover. We know that large sections of the economy have been severely hurt. And although after the first wave we have seen a pretty sharp recovery, in this second wave we may see quite a few more companies actually failing and not be able to recover. So the question is, how quickly can people, once the recovery gets underway, benefit from this? So I think the question indeed is, we will see recovery in 2021. Will it be in the first half? Would it perhaps be a little bit more in the second half? I think that that's open for debate. But no doubt, this has been a very unique recession. I mean, it's been one of the deepest recessions, if not the deepest recession we've ever seen in recent memory. But also, it's a recession where we've gone out very quickly, but we don't yet know what the longer lasting damage of this crisis really has been, which really gets me a little bit to your second question, because, in a way you could argue that there's a lot of damage done. There is now also an opportunity to actually use this opportunity to actually generate rapid growth, and whether this is related to more technology and faster productivity growth, or whether it is related to companies focusing more on the longer term and think harder about stakeholdership and not your shareholdership, or whether we think about how a new world trade system is going to look like. These are all things that we could potentially get right at this point in time. Now, to stay in my own lane, specifically on what it is we have to do in the area of technology innovation, you're right, we will need to begin to really build a public-private collaboration that is critical in order to make technology work and at the same time strengthen job growth and reduce the social damage of this. So the way to go about this has been well tested around the world. That's the building of these national innovation systems or regional innovation systems where business and policymakers and the education sector, which is extraordinarily important in this respect, begin to work together. That is difficult to do because it has to be done at a very granular level. You cannot do this kind of top-down at a national level and then just tell regions and local communities what to exactly do. These innovation systems come bottom up, and we have lots of examples of successful innovation systems in the United States, in Europe, all over the place. It's kind of interesting that you are there in Spain, I'm in the UK, which are actually two countries that really struggle a little bit with that, on how do we develop this relationship between central government and, on the other hand, letting regional and local governments really develop these innovation systems. There's a lot of political economy around this, so it's not so easy to all get this exactly right. So I believe that this crisis is giving us an opportunity that indeed some of the short-term developments that Ignacio has been describing can work to the advantage of getting out of this crisis soon, but there is this longer-term underlying challenge that we have to build a new way of getting business, policy, and education system work together. And that will be a big challenge. So I'm a little less optimistic, but also do clearly see a path forward in which we can make this happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Bart. And this question is for Martina. It is related to global cooperation, to cooperation for coming out, because this we have heard the prospects. The prospects are good, but the level of international cooperation that we're having now is not the best that we have had. Multilateralism is in some crisis, also as a reflection of confidence of citizens and sometimes of leaders on multilateral institutions, and they have applied more nationalistic approaches to recovery. We face challenges that probably when you face a global challenge, you have to to tackle it internationally, not domestically. So it seems that sometimes that we have reached the limit of multilateralism, and it is worrying. Do you think that there are prospects that we can recover the concerted action that we need at the global level in order to recover faster and be more efficient in our policies for coming out of this hole?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to consider where we stand with multilateralism. It's sort of a word that's thrown around quite a bit. And when we look at the usual measures that people usually use to estimate global powers, which is, of course, the size of the economy, the size of the population, and the size of their military might, one could actually say we're not looking at necessarily a multipolar world, but it's much more of a bipolar world, or the next decade will be much more about a bipolar state, which is dominated strongly by the US and China. We've heard that before from the different speakers as well. Of course, the EU could potentially play sort of a third pole if it really starts to act in a much less divided fashion and much more united around key issues, particularly when it comes to the defense and military aspect, as Natalie has mentioned also before. But so having that sort of backdrop is important, because that obviously will have an effect of how we think about multilateralism and multilateral organizations and institutions, because they won't be as effective as many have presumed under such a scenario, especially if it doesn't have the support of the big players. And I think that is sort of my first point, which is we need to be realistic that this only works if we get the big powers aligned and allowing this to happen going forward. And much of the crisis obviously is related to the fact that the big two powers have not wanted to play game and to play along with this. And particularly the US has withdrawn from a number of multilateral commitments. The second point I think that is important is that multilateralism comes in different forms, and we are seeing it evolving just as globalization has evolved. And it's important to also think about how can it take different forms from what we have thought about in the past. Of course, we are seeing big structural changes in the world economy and also security forces. And this is very much driven, of course, by the rise of China and the technology developments. But those will also affect the way that multilateralism will work. And with everything that is being, that has changed and is changing, many Western electorates have been much more skeptical of free trade, of China has become more assertive. And because of this upset of the equilibrium, medium-sized countries have become also more assertive, like Turkey, for example. And that leaves, of course, the US and the question around what will the US do in the future. And obviously, this is very much dependent on the outcome of the elections. But many have said, well, if Biden wins the elections, he's sort of the last of the Jedi. He's the American democratic multilateralist who will bring everything back into play. But I think the US has taken a certain path, particularly when it comes to its approach to China, which is quite skeptical, and I think it will remain skeptical of China. It might, become more, supportive of existing structures like the WTO, and it might even revive American interest in the CPTPP. But I think all of this has to be seen, and is not a guarantee. Certainly, it will look different, and we will not go back to what we've had. Now, you've also asked what can be done, and what can be really given that many of the global challenges have to be addressed, as you mentioned, also by a group of countries, and cannot be just dealt with on a national basis. I think one of the things that is clear is that we need to accept that change is inevitable and see the opportunities and come up with different approaches. And one of those, I think, is the rise, for example, of sectoral or geographic cooperation. which can be achieved and has been achieved. And I think this is one of the aspects that has been quite positive. Of course, institutions have a really important role to play. And many people are feeling disempowered and alienated by from their communities, and the multilateral institutions must really focus much more on recoupling, in a way, economic activities and social outcomes. So combining those two key outcomes in a much more deliberate way. And I think most importantly also, there is an ideological battle that needs to be fought and won ultimately. But we know there's a need for cooperation, because adapting and strengthening a rules-based and ethical global governance system is really crucial to securing long-term peace and progress. And in that respect, America's influence is going to be critical for the world as a whole, essentially, and for the system itself. And we need to make sure that the US is fully engaged and, again, takes a leadership role. And I would say also the European voice is extremely important in this on many aspects.
Thank you very much, Martina. Let's hope that America takes this leadership role that we seem to have lost for some time now. I would like to switch now because to a couple of questions on Spain. Once we are in Spain, this one will be for Jesus. Jesus, you're publishing a series of articles, very interesting articles in the Spanish press, proposing the need to implement these long-needed structural reforms to guarantee the competitiveness and resilience of our growth model. Could you shortly provide a short summary of what you are proposing?
Yes. So I start by observing that Spain has been underperforming in the European context for the last 20 years, and that this is putting the country on a very critical situation. And after having participated in the policy debate for over 15 years now, I have come to the conclusion that the key problem is the low capability of our state. A simple anecdote, which, to some extent is a perfect summary of what is going on, is the inability of the Spanish state to have a consistent and credible data set on COVID. I think there is a widespread consensus that Spain has absolutely the worst COVID data among any single advanced economy. The data are inconsistent, the definitions change, the numbers are completely unreliable, you cannot interpret them properly. This has been criticized by many different people. There has been a letter even in Lancet signed by hundreds of scientists. The Spanish government and the different regional governments do not seem to care that much about it. And I think this is the perfect summary of a system of public governance that has lost its contact with reality, that has been devoid of human capital, and a political elite that is incapable of running the government. And basically what I'm trying to propose is a number of reforms in terms, for instance, of how we select and promote civil servants and how we run the administration. This coming Saturday, there will be an article on how to tackle electoral reform, to have an electoral system that reflects better the priorities of the country, and so on and so forth. Because otherwise, talking about we need to increase productivity, we need to decarbonize the economy, etc., if you cannot build a proper state capability, none of those reforms is ever going to work. So that's kind of the punchline. Until you get the right framework, everything else is never going to work out.
Thank you very much, Jesus. Let me move to Ignacio. You know that Spanish economy is one of the worst hit in Europe and in the world, probably by the sanitary crisis and the measures applied to combat it, and especially because of the composition of our GDP, that's very with a very high weight of tourism and related sectors, is one of the reasons why we were hit harder than others. and our GDP is going to fall quite a lot, about 13% maybe this year. But there are different opinions about how fast we can recover. And I know that also your institution is predicting a path of recovery that sometimes is not the same as others, based on your detailed knowledge and study of the medical part of the pandemic part of the crisis. So could you expand a little bit on this, on how do you see the recovery of the Spanish economy in particular?
Yes, Spain lost 20 points of GDP, 22 points between March and June. So similar to the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, to put things into context. Back in May, many institutions, international institutions, were forecasting that Spain was going to lose about 5 points of GDP for the whole year, on the assumption that there was going to be only one wave. Now, that doesn't make any sense. If you study history of pandemics, there is no pandemics that just come and disappear in 3 months. This is not the right thing. So what we said is there is new waves coming, and GDP is going to contract 12.5 points. At that time, that was completely out of consensus, and it was called pessimist. Now, what I think is going to happen going forward is that new waves are going to keep coming, but they will have a lower intensity than past waves. And we can calculate that through number of dead people, again, which can infer which is the number of people who got infected. So this second wave is less malign than the first one, and the new waves will be less malign than the current ones. Okay. Under this scenario, I think it makes sense, again, to assume that you need to add up people that have gone through COVID and people who will get access to a vaccine to reach herd immunities. Okay, so according to the schedule of the European government and that of the Spanish government, around 30% of Spaniards could get access to a vaccine before June, and another 60% between July and December. Okay, even if you assume an efficacy of 65%, if you add these numbers to the numbers of people who have already gone through COVID, you can conclude that most large cities will be achieving herd immunity in H1 and the rest of the country by H2. Okay, herd immunity, by the way, depending on how you calculate it, it could be reached between 45 to 65%. New York City is at 43%, and the new cases are very limited. Now, based on this medical scenario, what we believe is that 2021 should be a quite positive year with a stronger growth than that predicted by consensus. First, this will be consistent with a normalization of most sectors because of the situation, medical situation I described. Second, the base effect will make it easier for a sharp GDP growth next year. And third, we should take into account the impact of the fiscal expansion of the European Union funds that will be moved forward to H1 by the government. So if you put all these things together, I think that the upside risk for 2021 is clear.
Thank you, Ignacio. It's nice to hear your positive message, and so you are optimistic, but you are right. Sometimes you have been optimistic and right in the past, so we are confident that you will be again in the future for this time. I think that with this this intervention, we have consumed almost 55 minutes of the time we had planned to dedicate to this session. I think that we will. I have been looking at the questions that came from the audience, but they came in advance, as I told you, when people were registering for this event. Many of them are related to Europe and the European issues, so I don't think it is worth to take any of those questions to put to you now. So I think that with this positive message of Ignacio on the prospects for recovery in our economy, we could conclude this session. But not before thanking all of you for your time and your time control, for having allowed us to keep to the time that we have available. And thank you for your interesting contributions to help us understand better what is going on and what is at stake, and how we can move on. And I would like also to thank all the participants that are following us online for your time. I will have to recall you that this is the first session also of the second session that will come tomorrow. And I want to pass the floor now for the conclusion of this part of this first day of our forum to Eduardo Serra. Eduardo Serra is the chairman of our advisory board of Círculo de Empresarios. He's also, as our chairman said, is the chairman of Everis Spain, one national consulting multinational company, and among many other important public and private responsibilities. And he will be in charge of closing the session today. So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you tomorrow again here. Thank you.